No, you intimidate them.
Good God, you're a woman. I couldn't have called that. You have actually excellent bone structure there. I'm kind of having a hard time not looking at you now.
Want to dance?
Oh, no.
All right,
Thank
come
you. No.
Mr. Stark, Christine Everhart, Vanity Fair magazine. Can I ask you a couple of questions?
She's cute.
You ever lose knowledge sleep your whole life?
Be prepared to lose a few with you.
Hello, I'm your host Movie Monto, and this is Movie Monto. Couple weeks back, there was a video on this channel discussing Captain Marvel and how she became a bit of an unlikable and unrootable hero because of her somewhat negative douchey personality. But as a counter argument, some of you accurately pointed out that wait a minute, if having douchey qualities makes Captain Marvel unlikable, then how come there's this other MCU character that suffers from the exact same negative douchebag personality but still is regarded as perhaps the greatest and overall most likable and rootable hero in the entire MCU? How come Tony Stark doesn't receive the same criticism as Captain Marvel? Obviously today, Tony Stark has gone through a massive transformation and is well known to be someone with overwhelmingly positive qualities. But if you hop in your time van machine to travel back to 2008 and the very first Iron Man film, you'll notice that things weren't always like so. In fact, Tony Stark of 2008 in many ways is actually the total opposite of the highly loved Tony Stark of 2019. I mean, forget the name Tony Stark for a moment and instead focus only on the list of personal qualities that here defines him. He sounds less like a hero and more like an actual villain. To be honest, if you wanted to talk about each negative personality trait of Tony Stark in the first Iron Man separately, you could do it for a full day. But for the sake of time and efficiency, we're going to take all of these negative traits and divide them into three major all-encompassing categories. Firstly, he's a cold-blooded arms dealer who profits directly from the misery and suffering of others. Secondly, he's a heartless narcissist who doesn't seem to care about anyone but himself. And thirdly, he's a massively arrogant douchebag who says and does whatever he wants, without any regard as to how it might affect the people around him. But the thing is, despite all that, Tony Stark in this movie is one of the most likable and most rootable heroes not only in the MCU, but in movies in general. As in, he's a character who suffers from very similar personality problems as Captain Marvel in a much worse way, but still somehow doesn't stumble into the same pitfall. Which is why we are here. Let's drive our time van machine back to the original Iron Man film that started it all and try to figure out what storytelling counters it uses for each of these three negative qualities to make Tony Stark a person that the audience can always care and root for. If you have a lead character with a downright villain-like personality, here's how you can turn them into one of the greatest heroes of all time. The first noticeable personality issue with Tony Stark is the fact that, yeah, he's an arms dealer. And in situations like this, you can always make the same basic excuses. You can say that, well, that's just what his company does. You can say that if it's not him, it's someone else, whatever. But none of these excuses matter because none of them change the reality. Tony makes a living by selling highly advanced means of death and destruction. And it's not like that's the case only with the quote-unquote good side. It's the case with everyone.
في تاريخ أمريكا.
He says, "Welcome, Tony Stark, the most famous mass murderer in the history of America."
Who are these people?
They are your loyal customers, sir.
Whoever holds the latest Stark weapons rules these lands.
In order to take this despicable, money-driven merchant of death character and turn him into someone that the audience doesn't just despise and can actually care about, there's a couple different things that the movie does. The very first of which is punishment. The movie begins with a 40-minute long story section that I like to call the "let's kick the shit out of Tony Stark" section. Even though there are character flashbacks as well as Iron Man creation plotlines also included, mostly this entire 40-minute section is dedicated to just one main purpose: punishing Tony for the wrongs he has done. Don't believe me? Just watch what happens in the first scene we see. After Tony gets blown up by his own bomb, we then move into the cave where he has to directly suffer and carry the consequences of being an arms dealer, figuratively as well as literally. For one, he's badly injured and probably always in some amount of constant pain. Secondly, he now has a magnet in his chest to stop lethal shrapnel from killing his heart. Thirdly, he has to carry a car battery with him everywhere he goes. And if that wasn't enough, he's also continuously mistreated and tortured until he builds a bomb for his captors, after which he'll be executed. Just like that, the negative image of a despicable merchant of death very quickly begins to fade away into something much more positive and likable. The punishment that Tony is forced to endure for being who he is, it's just so powerful and in a way so ironic. It's almost like a spiritual ritual for him to answer for the wrongs he's done and gain the audience's respect. And because of it, it's pretty much impossible not to take his side. Once the punishment period is over, the movie then builds on it with another positive layer. The fact that Tony's profession of selling weapons is actually a flaw.
I came to realize that I have more to offer this world than just making things that blow up. And that is why, effective immediately, I am shutting down the weapons manufacturer division of Stark International.
After getting perspective in the cave, Tony finally realizes that, okay, maybe what he's been doing isn't so great and should be stopped. Unfortunately, at this point, stopping it isn't going to be as simple as giving a statement to the media, which then turns the film into a redemption story about Tony doing everything he can to fix his own mistakes. And when you take this fixing a flaw narrative aspect and couple it with the earlier punishment, that's why the audience so strongly roots for Tony and wants him to succeed. Because realistically, it no longer matters who Tony Stark was or what he did before. All that matters is who he is and what he does now. Even though Tony manages to outgrow his image of an arms dealer, there's another part of his personality that he doesn't. He's a very self-centered and heartless narcissist who continuously mistreats his closest friends and views women as nothing but disposable objects. Overall, he seems to be the stereotypical billionaire playboy whose feelings concern only himself. In the flashback sequence before the cave, Tony's indifferent selfishness is apparent in pretty much every scene and every interaction. He receives an honorary award which his closest friend is there to present to him. He doesn't even bother showing up because he's too busy gambling in the next room. He gets confronted by a journalist about his weapons being used to kill masses of people. His only concern is on whether or not he can sleep with her, and so on.
3 hours.
I got caught doing a piece for Vanity Fair.
For 3 hours. For 3 hours, you got me standing.
Waiting on you now. Let's go.
Hey, Tony.
I'm sorry, this is the fun V. The humdrum V is back there.
What are you trying to get rid of me for? What, do you got plans?
As a matter of fact, I do.
I don't like it when you have plans.
I'm allowed to have plans on my birthday.
It's your birthday.
Yes.
I knew that. Already?
Yeah, isn't that strange? It's the same day as last year.
Unlike with the arms dealing aspect, Tony's obnoxious selfishness is never actually rectified. It's never established as a flaw. It's never anything he overcomes or changes away from. Probably because if the filmmakers did that, it would just be the same thing as with the first point, and it also take away the essence of who this character is. So for the most part, Tony throughout this movie and even the couple next movies mostly remains the same. A heartless narcissist playboy who repeatedly treats others like trash.
Hey, Tony. Remember me?
Sure don't.
Strategic Homeland Intervention
Right,
Enforcement and Logistics Division.
You, want to dance?
Oh, no.
All right, come
Thank
on.
you. No.
Oh, hey.
Fancy seeing you here.
Carrie.
Christine.
That's right.
So if we have an obnoxiously heartless narcissist who can't change, how can the movie possibly get anyone to like and support him? By making the story not about Tony Stark finding a heart along with the audience, but instead about the audience finding out that Tony Stark already has a heart that he's just hiding from everyone. Look at the relationship Tony has with Yinsen in the cave. He sticks up for Yinsen even if it means putting his own life on the line. He doesn't want Yinsen to go fight alone. He shares an emotional moment with him him when he's dying. Overall, it's crystal clear to the audience that Tony genuinely cares about Yinsen. And so, when we get back to civilization and see Tony revert back to his former narcissist self, it's like, wait a second, I thought he changed. But then we start to get more inside his head and begin to understand the truth. The way Tony presents himself in front of people and cameras, it's just an act. Whether it's because he's trying to keep up his father's legacy, whether it's because that's just the way he was raised up, we never get a definitive answer. But it doesn't matter. All that matters is the knowledge that this isn't really who he is. When Tony is once again confronted by the journalists about his weapons being used to kill civilians, he still doesn't take responsibility. But we know that in reality he does take responsibility. When Tony forces Pepper to dance with him even though she's nervous about it, everyone there might think it's him just pressuring her for yet another one-night stand. But we know that in reality he does it because he has genuine feelings for her. We know that in reality Tony cares more about others than he does about himself.
You've been re-engaged. Execute evasive maneuver. Keep going!
Whenever Bruce Wayne runs around town acting like a self-centered billionaire playboy idiot, it always works, because the audience knows that he's just playing a role, that deep down he's a good person with a golden heart. Same applies to Tony Stark. He might present himself as an obnoxious, heartless narcissist, but we know that deep inside his chest there is indeed a heart. It might be hidden under a magnet, but we know it's there. And that's why we care. The third and final potential problem with Tony Stark is something that composer Ramin Djawadi very excellently tied into the loud rock and roll music of the movie. The fact that Tony is quite a bit of an arrogant rebel who does and says whatever he wants without putting any thought into the consequences that might follow. He's the kind of guy who has no filter or taboo subjects. He's the kind of guy who passes you on the freeway driving twice the speed limit. He's the kind of guy who suddenly puts you in charge of a life and death situation without any warning. Overall, he's the kind of guy who has no problem making fun of you and embarrassing you in front of others.
Just remember that. Spring break, 1987. That lovely lady you woke up with. What was his name?
Don't do that.
Was it Ivan?
Don't do that. They'll believe that. Don't do that.
Public. Yeah, okay. Yeah. I am Iron Man. I don't have to do anything.
When I initially started to wonder why Tony's never-ending arrogance doesn't make him unlikable, one thing that came to mind was the reality that he can back all of that arrogance up. Whenever he walks into a room like he's the smartest person there, he most likely is the smartest person there. It's like the villain says, what a team of talented scientists are unable to build in a lab, Tony Stark built in a cave. But on second thought, that can't really be it, at least not alone. Even if you can back it up, continuous arrogance will at some point get annoying. But the reason Tony's arrogance never does is because he has something that most people like him don't. He's always genuinely funny. Look at the moment where he talks down to the female reporter. It's a bit of a douchey thing to do, but he does it in such an over-the-top comedic way that even the reporter ultimately is charmed by it. Look at the moment where he talks to the female soldier in a degrading and objectifying way. Maybe not the wisest choice, but again he pulls it off in a way that she just finds it funny and laughs, which really is the power of comedy in a nutshell. Being genuinely funny, that's the difference between receiving a smile or a sexual harassment lawsuit. That's the difference between being a likable character or an unlikable character. I mean, being funny is so effective that even if Tony didn't have the two previous points at his side, he'd still be highly likable and rootable. But of course, instead of me just saying that, see for yourself.
Found this in my sister's station wagon. It's an Iron Man doll. It's my nephew Timmy's. Timmy looks up to you. He wants to be you. Don't disappoint him. And don't disappoint America.
Thank you, Mr. Hammer.
Justin Hammer in Iron Man 2 is the antagonist equivalent of Tony Stark. He's an arms dealer with concern only for himself who constantly arrogantly puts himself above others. And he has none of the redeeming qualities that Tony does, aside from being funny. And that's enough. Even though Hammer is a villain, he's still one of the most likable characters in the entire movie. And he could easily carry his own solo film where he'd instantly have the audience on his side. Something which appears to give weight to the notion that being funny and being likable in some ways mean the same thing.
Threat here. Is that Justin Hammer?
How did Hammer get in the game?
Justin, you're on TV. Focus up.
You turn to the right.
Wow. Yeah, I'd say most countries 5-10 years away. Hammer Industries 20.
I'd like to point out that that test pilot survived.
Obviously, if you have a hero with questionable personality traits like Tony Stark in the original Iron Man that you want the audience to support and root for, be sure to make their evil ways a flaw that they have to overcome, and also maybe give them a golden heart that they're hiding from everyone. But if you're fully unable to do any of that, please do yourself a favor and at the very least make them funny.